Whether you want more innovation more easily, you're feeling burnt out or overwhelmed, or you simply know that something isn't quite the way you know it can be, you are not alone. I hear the same from leaders every day. On Uncommon Leadership, we explore aligning personal fulfillment with business success, creating authentic teams, and cultivating the resilience, adaptability, and ease necessary to move beyond simply surviving today's challenges into thriving. I'm Michael Hunter, and today we'll uncover fresh insights into what it means to lead uncommonly. Joining me today is Wes Clines. Wes is the Director of Engineering at DocuSign for their developer infrastructure and tools teams. Prior to this role, he spent 15 years at Microsoft, starting as an individual contributor on the .NET framework before joining the Bing organization and managing multiple teams. Welcome, Wes.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
I am excited for this conversation. When did you first recognize, Wes, that integrating your whole self, bringing that into everything you do, might be a valuable approach?
I was thinking about this, and I think it all distills down to when I started at Microsoft, I got my second manager, which, as you might imagine, happens, not infrequently at Microsoft. And that gave me a little bit of context to kind of compare and contrast both style differences, so to speak. And when my second manager, Tom, came in, it was a very stark change, both in transparency and authenticity. Basically, under his leadership, I got a little bit more of the full picture, and I think I could derive a little bit more meaning and purpose out of my work. And that certainly was, I think, one of the first things that I still to this day kind of think of as that turning point. I mean, this I think was a year into my professional career. And at least at the time at Microsoft, I mean, still probably some truth to this day, it was a place that certainly emphasized high performance and achievement. But I think what Tom brought was a little bit of a little bit of levity to create a little bit more of a positive and a bit of a cohesive environment and team. And when I take a step back and look, I saw kind of my own performance and even the approach that I took to, my work fundamentally changed. And that was for the first time I kind of internalized how that came about. And I think really being able to see how different managers or leaders interact both with the team and other leaders gives you a little bit more perspective on the different approaches on how various different people get things done and how that kind of rolls down to the team and how culture is derived from how these leaders interact and how these leaders manage down and up. And that second kind of manager was because Microsoft was my first job out of college, so I was still bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and that was kind of the first time where I got a different side of, I guess, Microsoft at that point in time. And having a little bit more of a differential in leadership helped me, I think, recognize that different styles are for different people and they get different results just based upon kind of the person that you are and what you bring to the table, and to a certain extent, what you bring to the company.
You still seem pretty bright eyed, Wes. I can't tell how bushy your tail is, though.
I try to keep that out there, right? I mean, I think that I'd like to think that I'm a positive person in general. I like to keep things light, but still, again, with a focus on we're all here to do a job, and you choose to spend it at a company. You're not forced to, and naturally, you want to keep good people and keep them on their growth journey. And I think having a little bit more of a positive spin and not always having that deadlines are getting missed, the world is about to fall down, having a little bit of a different approach is something that's kind of stuck with me, and I try as I might to bring that to bear. But I'm not always successful. I think we always have a room for improvement there.
Thank goodness. It's a lot easier to not be perfect when being perfect is pretty much impossible.
Yeah, no, I think it's always about when I went back to school to get my MBA, and there was a professor there. You don't need to be perfect, just pretty good. Pretty good's a lot closer to perfect than you might think. And, you know, when you're chasing perfection, you will inevitably always and forever fall up short. And that can, if you're constantly, getting down on yourself and seeing, the absolute worst of your game, or even worse than that, seeing that in others and never having that, positive side, it can, spiral out of control. And I think that that's a lot of times how teams, become divided and not unified.
Yes. If we go back a second to your first manager and then Tom, your second manager, what's an example of a situation that really showed you the difference between those two styles?
I will never forget this interaction. Not that it was super negative, but it's always kind of stuck with me. So, like any engineer would, or at least what I think an engineer would do, fresh out of college, I never had any formal computer science training. So that's probably, more, a little bit more descriptive and, kind of intuitive. But the, I think the thing that really stuck with me was I had at that time really tried hard to kind of catch up. I'm working with some of the most brilliant people that to this day I've ever met. Like everybody is super smart. Like it was a great place to be, but I found myself really putting in a ton of effort, both in intention and to a certain extent hours. I think that there were like 3 or 4 times where I just didn't leave the office overnight because we were trying to get things done. And obviously, as you might imagine, you can only do that so long before you kind of crash and burn, right? And I had taken my foot off the gas a little bit. I was still, to be clear, still putting in full days and getting things done, but certainly not at the velocity that I had been when I was more or less burning myself out. And I think I want to say it was around mid-year, or maybe kind of in between mid-year and annual, one of those two things. It might have been like 3 quarters of the way through the year, I think. And I was in a one-on-one, and we were kind of going through kind of my performance, just a little bit of a check-in. And out of nowhere, he's like, hey, I noticed that your throughput isn't as much as it used to be, like when you first started out. And that I vividly remember sitting in the chair in his office thinking, like, did I fail here? Like, what's going on? And I didn't really say much at the time, but like most of the focus, I just wanted to finish the conversation and get out of there, right? Because it's the first time I'd ever heard really anything, I don't know if I would say negative or perhaps constructive in my life. And I'm like, okay, great. I'm gonna figure out a way to just hammer this out, right? And improve. And then I think it was later that night when I was kind of thinking through that feedback and trying to process it. And when I take a step back, it was he had no idea that I was staying at the office many, many times over through the night, working through the night to meet deadlines. And I think historically growing up, it was one of those things where, just, bite down, hang on, and just try to power through, and not giving that context, right? And so when I got that feedback, I mean, technically speaking, valid, but it was one of those things where I don't think he understands how much I'm putting in this. Is my level of effort now bad? And I was just kind of left in the lurch, and I'd say the quality of the feedback wasn't particularly great. But when I switched managers, or this manager left the company and we got a new manager, and I was explaining this kind of situation through him, to him, excuse me. The way that he kind of works with me through it wasn't so much focused on my performance relative to my performance, but performance relative to expectations, right? It's like, no, you are doing great. Like, you don't need to change anything. I wish I could clone you 3 times over, which very different types of feedback. And I think in that first one, I didn't really understand, there were not enough hours in the day to make this manager happy, or, deliver to him what he needed to deliver to his management chain and leadership. And, when you just see one side of, okay, there's a whole lot of delivery and then it drops off. I mean, certainly that's something to, ask about, right? But it wasn't, hey, what's going on? Like, are you struggling? Like, how can I help you? It wasn't from that sense of, how do I help you get back on track? Or perhaps, was the track that you were on sustainable? Most definitely was not. And when, taking that transition to Tom, my second manager, he really took the time to kind of figure out, what was going on. He made it relatable to himself, like when he, was first starting out and things like that. And so, while the focus still was on the delivery, the what went into that and how it was, affecting me as a person, me as an engineer, and honestly, how I felt about Microsoft culture at that point in time. I think this was 2007, I want to say. And it took, probably that next whole year for me to truly understand, okay, no, I might have, bouts of great performance, and then I might not. Like, we're not robots, and, it's a little bit of a roller coaster. And his point was, we don't like roller coasters. We want just consistent things. And, it's not a straight line, but don't kill yourself, but still focus on, delivery. And I think juxtaposing those two experiences and those two types of feedback, I mean, it was very clear that, Tom brought everything about his experience to the table. And, he would relate to his own personal failures. I mean, here's what I'm good at, here's what I'm not good at, right? And leaning into it versus trying to hide your weaknesses away in the closet and, not deal with them. Like, hey, this is not done, why is it not done? And kind of being, on the verge of militant and regimented versus, let's understand, qualitatively what is going on and how do we fix it. So, there are a lot of learnings in those first 2 years. And I think I got, really both sides of that fence early on. And that certainly kind of stuck with me, in my own growth journey, even transitioning from IC to management and leadership and things like that.
It sounds like manager number one made an observation about a concrete fact and then didn't go anywhere else. Didn't ask any questions, curiosity based or otherwise, about why that was. Didn't give you any context on whether this was good, bad, or indifferent. Left you to assume that it was bad because he was asking. And so you had no idea what to do with it or how to change in a way that would make him happy. Whereas
Correct.
manager number two gave you the context, asked those curiosity-based questions, helped you understand where you were relative to what you should have been evaluated on. Who knows what the first guy was evaluating on because he never told you.
Right.
Job ladders are there to give guidance as to what you should be being evaluated on. And it sounds like that's what manager number two, Tom, was doing. And so, of course, you felt more heard, more seen, more appreciated, and way more willing to go above and beyond when that was necessary.
Absolutely. I've always kind of internalized this basic metric. Hey, would your team follow you into the dark? Right. That's, I mean, when I sum up, hey, am I being a good leader? And it's, not just about, blind faith, but more often than not, if there are things people are scared of, whether it's a challenge, internally, we call them big bets, and it's not abundantly clear how on earth are we going to get all this work done. Do they have faith in me to understand, hey, I'm going to drive that clarity, give them, to a certain as objective metrics as I can, and not just tell them to do things, but it's kind of like leading from the front. Help them. Here's where things are going wrong, and here's why, and here's kind of my experience. And the feeling that you're feeling or the feedback that you're getting is not unique in this world. You're not alone, right? I mean, we can talk about imposter syndrome all day, but these are valid feelings, they're valid curiosities and concerns, and they can be worked through. The sun's going to rise again tomorrow, and we can just work through it. But I think it's that sense of togetherness and purpose to a common goal that really, I think, creates that team culture, and allows leaders to actually lead versus, manage.
So, what are some concrete things that manager number three, Wes, does to help your people feel seen, heard, and appreciated right from the start?
Right. I would say I was having this conversation with one of my directs within a one-on-one the other day. And, I think for me, it starts with transparency, right? We always talk about how we arm people and empower people, but do people understand the lens through which their actions, decisions, or whatever it might be will be evaluated and or judged, right? To your point, like there's a career ladder, like here's, how you get to the next level, here's level expectations. And kind of, again, leaning into it and being transparent and conquering those things head on. Like, here's how I make decisions. Here's how I handle mistakes or incidents, right? And, here's kind of the way that I work, and being very transparent about that, right? One of the topics I was talking about, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, was, I tend to catch up on work late at night. A lot of meetings during the day. It's nature of the beast. And I'll follow up with stuff that people need from me or things that they're concerned about. And generally speaking, that goes well into the night and early morning hours. And, one of the things that I am very, very explicit about is if I ask you a question or if ultimately it is a question. If I ask you a question at midnight in Slack, number one, I'm not calling you, I'm not texting you. I do not expect an answer at all until whenever the next business day is. And that's something that I hold dear. I know, that's something that I probably should, be better about, like that. I think that there's the send later function. Most of the time I forget about it, and, that's on me, so that, they're not trying to, like, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, seeing a text from me and, feeling this need or pressure to answer. But, kind of getting back to it, I think a lot of it comes down to how transparent are you about what it is you're doing, what the team's doing, what your perspective is, both the good and the bad, and how, your team or teams fit into that, decision-making criteria. But also, transparency on its own isn't enough. And I think the second part of that is, being very consistent in those things, right? So here's how I make decisions. If I change how I make decisions, that's definitely inconsistent, and that starts to give rise to, is he going to like this or is he not, right? And being consistent about how we handle mistakes. Mistakes happen, and I always say, at some point in your career, you're going to cause a sub 1 or a sub 0. It's going to happen. There's very little that you can do to stop it, right? But here's how I handle these things. Like, yes, they're mistakes. I don't need to remind you about it, because chances are, we all have a sense of pride in our work. And, if something that you check in or deploy ends up causing an incident, you're naturally going to feel bad about that. I don't even need to remind you, right? And we're going to have we'll diagnose the incident and all this other fun stuff, and you will naturally learn, right? And all of these words need to be backed up by actions, right? You have to, when we go through incidents, I'm expecting people to look at me and see how I react to those things, right? Again, it's all learning. And when those words are backed up by action, or at least I am consistent in the things I do and reasonably transparent about the things that I can absolutely be transparent about. That all kind of leads towards a culture where we all tend to know exactly what we're doing. We know why we're doing it. I think, the why always matters. And the way that I do things is very consistent and doesn't change, not in the sense of it's inflexible, but you always know what to expect and aren't scared to share bad news, right? You're not scared to say, oh, we had an incident. Oh, you're not scared to make a mistake because it's going to be a learn. Like you're not scared to make a decision because you know how I would evaluate them. And so, that feeling of, and I guess we would call it psychological safety. Like I want people to feel safe, and I'm not going to go bite their heads off on a decision that they make. I might not be happy about it, right? And that's okay, but that doesn't make them a horrible dev or less of a person, or feel that like they should be scared to come to work the next day, right? We all make mistakes. To your point about perfection earlier, nobody's perfect. I certainly am not perfect. I have created all kinds of incidents in my career, and I have learned from every single one of them, and that has shaped, how I have developed in my own growth journey. I'm no different than anybody else. I just might be older. That's about it.
So it sounds like transparency and consistency are two tools you use to build cultures where your people feel safe and empowered to bring their unique talents to everything that they do. What else is in your toolbox that helps you build those cultures?
I I would say the probably the next most important one is it's time. I have one-on-ones with everybody that reports through me. Perhaps not as often as I would like, but again, when we think about, you can be transparent, you can be consistent from a distance, right? And you know, probably the next biggest tool in that toolbox is minimizing that distance. And I don't want people to feel like that I'm not approachable, like I'm sitting in some ivory tower throwing decisions out, for them to go pick up, right? It's by minimizing the distance between myself and certainly my directs or my skips or so on and so forth, that oftentimes gives me a lot more perspective in what they're going through based upon some of the decisions that I've made, right? So when we talk about not being perfect, I'm certainly not the most perfect leader on the planet by any margin, but without that feedback loop, right? You're not building a culture of being able to speak up or manage up or deliver bad news, whether it's to their direct line manager, their skip, or et cetera, et cetera. And the more often that I talk with folks, and oftentimes it's sometimes it's about very personal things, sometimes it's just kind of shooting the breeze. The other times it's like, hey, I've seen this, and observations, and kind of digging into it, kind of having that perspective that my first manager certainly did not, and that inquisitive nature. But being able to kind of tie in all of the things that we've just talked about, but also hearing it from me directly, and not just by observing me in our Q1 status, or like our all hands or things like that. It's getting to know these people on an individual basis and understanding more about them, because again, as I'm sure you've noted, and talked to other folks as well, you can't manage the everybody exactly the same. And if you're trying to build that culture, and you're trying to get the most that you can out of them, you naturally have to take everything that they are and figure out ways to blend it in. And if you don't know what their strengths, their weaknesses, the the things that make them unique, that they can bring to the table, you're going to be missing out on a whole lot of interesting opportunities that might not otherwise present themselves. Whether it's a specific, hey, I've used this tool before. Here's how we can integrate it. Great. Here's how we've handled incidents at Google or Meta or any of the other places folks have come from, by just sitting there and listening and taking action, right? Like you can tell me all these things, but if I don't really internalize it and put it to use, kind of what's the point? It becomes more of a checkbox. And so, those skip level one-on-ones, and hearing their stories, figuring out what makes them tick, and how do I best position them, their team, for opportunities that leverage those skill sets, and how does that make them feel like they can bring all of this to the table, even though that might not be something they have traditionally been responsible for. So there's there's a lot of different things in there, but certainly the transparency, consistency, and you got to know the people, right? If you're not having one-on-ones with them, start. Takes a lot of time, but it's time very well spent.
How do you balance taking all the time to get to know your direct reports, their direct reports, however far down the chain you go, which could be a more than full time job, even with just two levels,
Sure,
with all
definitely.
the other stuff that you're responsible for as a manager and as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, those are existential questions that I continue to ask myself to this day because, you're definitely right. I think on one hand, naturally, stuff just has to wait until, you know, 9 o'clock at night when I can actually do it. Right. And that's a lot of just kind of spending time writing feedback for, annual or, doing big plans, writing specs or one pagers. Those are things that unfortunately tend to, limit themselves to when the sun is not in the sky. And your days do get filled up with meetings. And kind of the way that I look about it, I have a spreadsheet of, I think it goes across, I think it's an entire quarter, right? It's like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And I have chunks of time that I reserve in there for, generally speaking, important things. And I have one slot, I think it's every day at 10:30 a.m. is this, I almost certainly every single day of every year have a one-on-one at 10:30 with somebody. And so I kind of have these blocks of time where I know I'm just having one or two one-on-ones so that I can get to all my folks, generally speaking, once a quarter, give or take. Now, if you're the CEO, clearly that's not going to clearly not going to work, right? And so one of the things that I've kind of learned from my manager now is the concept of team on ones, right? To where it's just the skip and one of the teams without the team's engineering manager there. And part of it is, I mean, I know it sounds like, oh, let's debate your manager's performance and things like that, but it's more for the purpose of understanding, hey, what's going on, like what is working, what's not working, like are the things that I'm communicating through to your manager getting to you? Is there a disconnect somewhere along the line? And that's, to a certain extent, something that's kind of going on right now, and certainly something that I need to address. But the nice thing is, I know about it, right? And if you don't, take the time, and unfortunately, there's no shortcut. Like you have to communicate, you have to spend the time to build those relationships to understand. Now, whether that happens 4 times a year for your skips and so on and so forth, whether you do kind of the batch processing, so to speak, with the team on ones, there's a couple of different ways that I found to be successful depending upon what you're going to get. But thus far, I'm kind of at the brink where if we continue to add, new people or new teams, I'm going to have to rethink some of this, kind of to your point. But regardless, even if it's, once a year, right? Having the ability to have that conversation, and I don't come up with the agenda. It's 100% up to if the IC wants to talk about, or the EM for that matter, why the sky is blue. I mean, that's your prerogative, right? Doesn't seem like the best use of time, but that's their time, and I am here to honor their time. I've never talked about why the sky is blue, just for the record, but it gives everybody a chance to talk through the things that are most important to them, and they may not have anything to do with work, right? Hey, in a couple months, like my fiance is moving to so and so, and I would like to go remote. Or hey, I need to go travel to take care of a family member, right? Those are the things that come up relatively often that if I didn't have that conversation, I would be asking, why is this person out for a month? Like we've got to get that done. And kind of to your point, like that starts to kind of invite some rushes to judgment and perhaps some label that might completely be true. I think it is super honorable for somebody to go, take care of their parent while they're sick and things like that. And those are things that I certainly want to support, because chances are that's a good person who's, innocent. Like, they're not choosing, I mean, they're choosing to do this, but, they were kind of thrust into this position and by no real fault of their own or anybody. And without getting that context and having those connections, how deep or maybe perhaps superficial, if nothing else, I as a leader am aware of kind of what's going on, and you know, I can address things as and when they need to, and we can work together to find a good result. Because over time, when you build up enough of those things, eventually you get to that point where, going back to kind of that previous analogy, I will follow this person to the end of the earth because they are amazing. They get that they all have a fundamental insight onto me, my needs as a human, not just an IC, writing code. And I have full confidence that come whatever challenges may, this person is going to be, I know exactly how this person is going to react, and we're going to get through it together, right? Because it is a two-way street.
How do you know when you know enough about a person?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. You know, I think a lot of it is when I, kind of think back to the friendships that I have like outside of work that have nothing to do with work, and the sheer amount of time we have spent together, right? I mean, if you added it all up consecutively, it'd be weeks and weeks and weeks and months. And, obviously as you grow older, like, you don't have as much time to do those things. But when you have those seeds, then the kind of touch points or checkpoints don't need to be infrequent. Like, when I talk to my friends, I can pop in and say, hey, what's going on? I saw something funny or whatever. We just kind of pick up where we left off because we have that solid base. And so, kind of relaying that back into the workplace, when I take a step back and think about it, I talk to each person, I think 4 or 5, well, each certainly skip like 4 or 5 times a year, one on one. And I don't know that you will ever fully get to know a person talking to them 4 times a year, right? And so, to that end, like what I think about skip level one on ones specifically, I don't think that there's ever a time where you can say, like, okay, good, I know this person fully. I know you. I've got you. Like, we're good. We don't need to have this recurring meeting. If something pops up, feel free to schedule time in my calendar, which people do anyways. But I think really what strengthens the organization and the culture is having those lines of communication defined, planned for, and when we get to that, we all know, or the both of us know, here's what we want to get out of this meeting. Here's kind of what we talked about last time. Here's how, the tips or feedback or whatever it is that they give them. Here's how it's working. It could be good, it could be bad. And so, long-winded way of saying, I don't think you ever know enough about a person, right? Because again, people come, people go, and if you don't have those slots, I mean, popping up stack a little bit, right? When we were talking about there's not enough hours in a day, when people leave, I just hold that slot for like a to be hired. Like, if we're going to backfill the position or somebody new comes in, I can just slide them right in there and not have to completely blow up my schedule, right? And so, it helps me have that reserved time for that person. We can talk about, whatever's bothering them, both professionally in their lives, and how we go from there. But gosh, yeah, I don't think you ever really know enough about a person to really understand, what they're going through, what's going on, beyond, hey, I've worked with you for 10 years and now I've moved to a team that's adjacent to you, to where we still see each other. And great, maybe we don't have those, you know, monthly, bi-weekly, whatever one-on-ones. Like I have one-on-ones with people that do not report to me anymore, right? They did it one time. I mean, they're very infrequent, right? But at the same time, it's allows me to understand more about what they're doing. And, at least from a professional standpoint, hey, what are the things that you're invested in? Because I'm not talking to your leadership chain, at least beyond kind of like high level, company objectives. And so, I think it's just lines of communication, and the more lines of communication you have open, I think the better that you can align and advocate for yourself and your teams. And so, no, I don't think you ever really know enough.
I appreciate the structure you found everything on, Wes. I can see the quarter spreadsheet that you have on with all the time slots and who goes where. That gives you the ability to plan out at that larger scale that we can't really keep in our heads or really see on our calendars on the computer. That lets you do this deep interpersonal relation without stressing that things are getting dropped off because everything is there.
Yep.
And what you say that we can't ever really know anyone enough really resonates for me, in part because if we when we say if we were to say I know someone well enough, what we're really saying is I know someone well enough for all the things I've needed to know them in terms of, and we never know what's coming that we're going to need to know something about.
Exactly. Exactly. I think I couldn't have said it better myself. Definitely. I don't ever want certainly people that I manage or I lead to feel that, this is a relationship that is business only. And the second that it doesn't provide value to me, right, that we are severing those ties. Because fundamentally, what I need is, my goal is to get teams to deliver more value. That doesn't necessarily mean more hours or more bugs fixed or whatever it is. It's fundamental value. And by I don't want to say severing some of these, meetings that I do have with ICs and skip level ICs and things like that, or EMs for that matter. By severing that, you're basically saying either A, I have everything I need from you. I have no use for you anymore. I know that sounds bad, but to a certain extent, it can absolutely be internalized like that versus, kind of how I think about it. I need you, manager or IC or whatever it is, to really understand what we're doing here because I need you to execute. And I know that at some point you're going to need something from me, right? You need to be a servant leader. Like I want to unblock you to do your best work. And if we're not having those conversations, whether they're casual or in a one-on-one, it doesn't really matter truly. But if you're not comfortable sharing those things with me, you don't have the time and space to share those things with me. How on earth can I have an effective team or teams or organization to execute on these business goals, objectives of the day, year, whatever? And moreover, or more than that is, are you going to be here for the long term? Or are you seeing me as like, okay, this person has no real use for me. I'm going to go look for another team, right? Or look for another company, right? Whatever that is. And if somebody's leaving a team and they're leaving to a different company, hey, that's great. It happens all the time. But I want you to leave for like, hey, here's an opportunity. That's not because, I don't like Wes or I don't like my management chain. It's just, hey, it's a different opportunity that I'm interested in. Yeah, it happens, right? I've left teams before, not because they're horrible managers or anything. It's just a different opportunity, and I never want people to feel that their utility has been used up and they need to go seek an opportunity. They have no room for growth.
So it sounds to me that the a way, maybe the way, you help your people feel seen, heard, appreciated, welcomed is you give them a foundation for interacting with you. You tell them, I'm going to do my darndest to understand who you are. That can never be enough. Your responsibility, your a primary job I am giving you here today is to tell me what I need to know to help you. Because at the end
Yep,
of the day, my job is to help you do your job. And if you can't do your job, then I'm not doing my job.
exactly.
So it's great that people feel seen, heard, appreciated, valued, loved, want. What's the business value of creating these cultures?
You know, I was thinking about this kind of in the context, I think, to the first question you asked, right? It when my first manager, left, and I got that new manager, and I could start, you know, I was a little bit more, I would say, I don't know if I would say valued, but I felt more comfortable in my role, that I wasn't fundamentally failing, and that, hey, you're doing just fine. Like, just communicate better, or, whatever. I can't exactly remember the exact contours of the feedback, but it was something along those lines. When as a leader now, I going through that myself, my output and my investment in my team was significantly higher, kind of in the new world order, so to speak, with my second manager. So when I think about the business value, I think you're naturally going to get more out of people, simply because they're not afraid to make mistakes. Because if you're not making a mistake, you're probably not learning, right? So that's one. Two, they're not afraid to, you know, be wrong, or, share a difference of opinion, or, disagree, right? A little bit of disagreement's healthy. You get better designs and all kinds of things, right? And so when you bundle all this together, you ultimately get more output. If you're talking about business value, things generally speaking get done faster, number one. But the second part of that is, you're not burning people out left, right, and center, to where they feel like, okay, I'm just mentally exhausted. I need to go take a 2 week long break. And then now we're all trying to scramble. How do we structure or shift, or perhaps delay deliverables or milestones to kind of fit this person who we just burnt out, right? So, I don't know that I think it's hard to objectively say, this is clearly the value. But what I have seen is we get more out of people. Turnover is significantly less. Trying to hire, quality people quickly, very difficult to do, right? And so when you're kind of on a trajectory where things aren't going well, people are unhappy and they're leaving. Well, the business objectives don't change just because, somebody wanted to leave to go to Microsoft or Amazon or any of these other places. And so, by virtue of the fact that you're kind of creating that space and that culture where the person that you are is fundamentally welcome into this team, or they're going to be comfortable, they're going to be happy, and things just naturally flow. There's, not really a lot of, workplace drama. There's not a lot of, you know, backstabbing, at least kind of like on, like the old Microsoft, where like, hey, for me to get a promotion, I got to make you look bad, things like that. That stuff just tends to fall by the wayside. And, we're focusing on, how do I make myself as productive and impactful as I possibly can, because I don't have to worry about all these other things. I know exactly how Wes is going to react to this, or if I presented them with this, you know, problem, right? And the options that I have, I know exactly which one he's going to pick. So basically, he's just, yep, that makes sense. Here's what, and he'll probably give me some type of feedback. So I think it really comes down to, you get more performance because people aren't scared. They're not worried about what somebody else is going to think, right? There is a little bit more of a bias for action and, less turnover, right? I think the turnover is a huge one, especially in this day and age. Hiring people is tough. And if you have less turnover, you don't have to like, okay, well, this person left the company. Shoot, they were working on some very big project. Not great, but understand why they left. So now we got to figure this out. So I think all of those kind of in conjunction are really what deliver the true value to a business and an organization. But and then the other thing is, the more alike that we see ourselves, like as people, not just as ICs, managers, leaders, right? Despite the different levels or roles or expectations, the faster that we can get to kind of the root of those issues, get in alignment and, communicate both good and bad, you're kind of greasing the wheels of business so that they can spin faster or not run as hot or just fundamentally keep the train on the tracks and keep moving. So, that's kind of how I think about what happens to the value when you're able to bring everybody's kind of whole self, personality, strengths, weaknesses into the fold. Identify it, talk about it, address it, and we can get on to bigger and better things because, like, hey, that's cool. We're fine with that. Don't worry about it. Let's just focus on this specific objective.
Yes. So there's, everyone's strengths and can arrange work to give people what they love doing. You know everything people don't love doing, and you can arrange work so they don't have to do that. 'Cause there's probably someone else on the
Well,
team that'd be happy to pick that up anyway. All
yeah,
the energy,
yeah,
all the energy that people would otherwise be spending griping about the work they're doing that they don't want to do, lusting after the work that they're not getting to do that they would love to do, and trying to navigate all of the office mechanics and politics and squishy people stuff,
yeah, agree.
that they're worried about how things are coming out. All that energy can go to doing that work that they love doing.
Definitely. And I wanted to kind of, you had mentioned, the things that you don't want to do. There, I mean, there's always work that people don't want to do. I always call it kind of eating your vegetables. It's like I want you to have as much dessert as possible, but hey, we got to eat these vegetables too. And again, being transparent about, hey, we can't all do everything that we lust for all the time. I wish it worked like that, believe me, but the business has needs and these needs have values, et cetera, et cetera. But I think people are more understanding, like, hey, why am I having to do this, right? Why can't this other person do this? Why can't this other person do that? When it's all out for the world to see, right? Like, hey, they're busy on this thing. Not that I have to, explain that, right? Because it's right there. But everybody at some point is gonna have to do something that they don't want to do. Pick up, whether it's picking up the slack or helping out during an on-call rotation, right? But when you have that sense, when you have that culture, truly that team-based culture is like, I want the team to succeed, and if the team succeeds, chances are I am succeeding as well. To your point about the office politics and mechanics, people genuinely speaking not only care about the team but care for one another enough to lend a hand, eat the vegetables and do all the, rote tasks that perhaps people don't want to do. Or they do the rote tasks enough to where they figure out a way to automate it, right? Which is even better, right? Everybody loves automation. And so I think having that shared sense of understanding of how decisions are made and, to a certain extent, how work is assigned, whether it's, hey, a FIFO, I just go pick a ticket off of a queue, or if we're talking about more organized, business plan, which is kind of where we're executing on right now. People are generally more receptive when they understand the why and the fact that this is not something that they're going to get stuck with forever. Like maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's a week, I don't know. But I have found that people are okay with perhaps not the most glorious of work when they understand the value to the business and why it's important. And when you have a culture that values the team over me, those are easier conversations than in organizations where that has not been the case.
Yes. And on top of all of that, when you understand what lights a person up, almost always there's a way to engage that, to find that in the thing that they aren't excited about doing. And so they still may not be excited
Absolutely.
about doing it, but they're less unexcited about doing it.
Exactly. It's about minimizing distaste rather than maximizing happiness, at least in this specific instance.
Maybe we spread some ketchup or mustard or whatever the spice you like on those vegetables, and it's a little more palatable to
Sure.
you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I like that analogy. I'm going to have to use that next time.
Pull out the ranch for much of America.
There you go.
How do you help your people, Wes, find their way through all the change, uncertainty, and overwhelm that seems to be all that life is these days?
So I think that goes back to some of the things I mentioned before, right? In one-on-ones and skip one-on-ones, but more importantly, or I would say most importantly, is that it starts with listening. We all have our biases and assumptions about what is or isn't going on or what the reasons for something is or isn't. But when you try to perhaps empathize with a specific situation that is happening, everything starts with listening. Like, I listen far more. Wow, I can talk a lot, but I tend to listen far more than I speak, simply because I want to understand, right? Because that's kind of that first part. You got to listen, you got to understand. And then I've found a lot of success, and this just kind of comes back to the whole, bringing your whole self and being, again, very transparent about both business, but also, kind of my own personal experiences. And there's probably very little that, my ICs or, my managers or skips or whoever it is, there's probably an analog that I've come across, in my own career, right? Whether it's when I was an IC or early on in my management career, you know, the challenges are generally speaking very similar, right? Not exactly identical, but similar. And, I've found that especially when we're talking about challenges, I almost naturally go to a time and place where, I failed, excuse me, and how I dealt with that, right? And, kind of, but again, I'm not trying to make these things about me by any stretch of the imagination, hence why you got to start with listening. But I found that trying to find that common ground with, whatever it is that people are, upset about, right? Whether it's, layoffs and uncertainty, or, hey, this team got a new manager and, I really need them to deliver something so that I can deliver my thing, right? And part of it is just understanding that, yes, these are challenges, right? And if you're kind of in that pocket where you're a little bit uncomfortable, right? Seeing that, kind of to your point about kind of spinning it a little bit, right? Kind of adding the sauces to the vegetables, so to speak. When you come at it in a perspective of, okay, I hear you. You're uncertain about this. You're worried about that. How do we turn that into kind of a learning or a growth opportunity? Whether it's, in one, this was probably a year and a half ago or so, a peer team, had a managerial change, and that peer team was delivering something that, one of my teams really needed to, you know, land some, some big changes internally. And now there was, I think the manager, yeah, it's the manager kind of brought up, like, how am I supposed to, like, I'm very nervous about this. I was like, well, you know, the only real, I'll tell you what I would do if you want to hear that, right? But fundamentally, we're never going to know if we don't just go talk, right? Everything always starts with the conversation, right? And so, then I think I went into some examples, kind of through my own career, but, fundamentally understanding that, yes, this is something that's uncomfortable with them, turning it into, hey, you know, these are things that, we have to deal with. This is not going to be the last time this happens. Maybe it's the first time it's happened for you, but it's certainly not going to be the last. So let's think about, how do we attack the problem, right? Is it a problem that we need to solve? And how do we approach it to where you're not feeling uneasy, you're uncertain, right? Is it a lack of confidence? Is it, hey, you worked with this person and they're not, you don't like working with this person, or whatever it is? And so, just kind of drawing upon my own experiences and listening to, what they have to say and what the root of the challenge is. And then, 99 times out of 100, it's, hey, let's just take, we're worried about this giant boulder. Let's break that problem. Let's break that boulder apart into some rocks, and let's focus on a couple rocks at one time, right? And eventually, at some point, we'll be all past this, right? Because again, the world's going to keep turning, business is going to keep booming. We're just going to have to take things one day at a time. And it's like that old adage: Rome wasn't built in a day. Hey, it's okay. Let's not worry too much about it. And again, we can work through it together, right? And it's not one of those tasks that an IC or a manager or whoever has to go solve. Like, hey, we are in this together. We are a team. We can solve this together and work through whatever it is. And that's been successful for me thus far. Haven't had any issues with it, so I'll keep on doing it. But again, it's really just listening and understand, and having, I think, the mental wherewithal to know, even though I might have a similar experience, to what they're going through, or what the challenge is, that doesn't mean it's the same, right? And so I bend over backwards to try and not say, hey, here's the solution, right? This is what I did because I'm so amazing. Like, I don't have all the answers, and I'm very transparent about not having all the answers. But have you thought about this, right? And just kind of asking more of those clarifying questions, because more often than not, we'll get to a point where I've just asked them kind of clarifying questions and broken it down a little bit to where they've kind of self-solved whatever the issue is, or at least have a frame of reference to go attack something. And I'm just a sounding board at that point, right? Which, as far as I'm concerned, is a success, right? Because I want them to kind of go through that on their own and arrive at their own conclusions, so that they feel that, hey, the next time something similar or the same issue happens, they have, kind of a little bit of a playbook to draw from.
Yeah. Your experience helps you understand where they're probably coming from. You employ your curiosity and your listening to discover where they're actually coming from. And then you bring that experience back in to help you pinpoint places where they might need a little clarification, where they might be missing some options or opportunities that you can help them discover for themselves. And you keep going in this cycle of experience feeds empathy, feeds curiosity, feeds, which goes into listening, and then it brings it back into experience, empathy, curiosity, listening. You're in a nice reinforcing cycle there.
Yeah. And, a lot of times, I would say it's probably 50-50 split, if I had to guess. Half the time it's, life experience, right? It's not that they're concerned about something that has really nothing to do with work. And maybe it is impacting, their ability to kind of focus or concentrate, or, whatever it is. But, oftentimes, I was kind of giving my perspective on, I think it was a housing purchase, not too long ago, right? They were like, it was the first time that they were, contemplating, um, buying versus renting and all those other fun things. And, far be it from me, I am not a financial advisor by any stretch of the imagination. But again, you know, I went through that at one point too. I remember, putting the down payment down and being like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And, kind of to that point, it's a life experience that, I've gone through and this person is now going through. And, if nothing else, it's just a reassurance that what you're feeling, very natural. Felt it very much myself. And I'm sure every first time home buyer is going to go through the same thing. So it's kind of that, you're not alone. There's not really a right answer. And if you're making a mistake for whatever, for whatever definition of mistake you want to call it, at the end of the day, it's a problem that can be solved, right? You're not going to die if you make the wrong decision or no decision at all. It's, again, all you can do, and this is something that I kind of beat, for lack of a better term, into, my teams, is hindsight is always 2020. If you can say with a straight face that you made the best decision that you could for whatever it is, personal, work, whatever, given the information that you had at that time, don't try to rejudge previous decisions, because at that point, kind of, full circle going back into perfection, you are measuring yourself against perfection and you will always come up short. And, that's something that has done me well in my own personal life, but also, applying it to, strategic decisions or investments that we do or don't make, right? I wish we would have started this 6 months ago because it would be very helpful now. Well, what we knew 6 months ago, from how many people we had, what the cost estimations were going to be, how much it physically cost the business, what the business's big bets were at that time, we made the right decision. It's unfortunate that between now and then there was a big change or a strategic shift, but that's okay. That's business. That's life. Things change, and if we have that, mental model of dealing with change and have, that support system, whether it's, at home with a family member or professionally with your manager, Skip, peer, whomever, mentor, mentee, we're all we're all on a spinning rock in space at the end of the day. We're all imperfect. We all make mistakes. And while the problem that or uncertainty or change or whatever it is certainly unique to you, it is probably not a unique challenge when you have a broader perspective. And so it's trying to bring that breadth of perspective in to make sure that they're just kind of focusing on the problem, not trying to, bring other things into where they feel the weight of the world and, they start to shut down. Because I've had that happen, in my career previously. And I think a lot of that experience is kind of formed the thought process that I have now, right? Because it wasn't going well. Hey, let's separate these things out a little bit. Let's talk about this one. Like, why do you feel that way? And being able to kind of attack them piecemeal versus trying to solve world hunger all at once. You know what I mean?
Yes. A long time ago, early in my career, a colleague told me, at the end of the day, it's all zeros and ones. If one of those gets interposed with another one, like, it's not a big
That
deal.
is that is hilarious because a slightly different adaptation of that. It's, there's always that question of, can we do it? Right. And I always come back at the end of the days, it's ones and zeros. So it's software. Yes, we can. We're not asking about can, we're asking about should, right? Or if we don't, what happens? What value does that bring? Of course it can be done. But at the end of the day, right, it's a should question. It's ones and zeros. Like, we can make it do whatever we want to do. It's just, is that the right choice for the business? It's all the other decisions that go into that one, right? That's hilarious.
So, Wes, what is the best way for people to connect with you if they would like to get more in with you on how you approach leadership, or if they would like to choose manager number three and come work with you?
The best way is certainly on LinkedIn. Search Wes Clines. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one on there, but I'm definitely the only one at DocuSign. That's by far and away the best way to get a hold of me. Otherwise, you can email me at wes.clines@docusign.com, and I will do my best to handle the torrent of email that I get in a given day. But certainly, LinkedIn is by far and away the best way to get a hold of me.
That's great. And Wes, what would you like to leave our audience with today?
I would say to managers or leaders, I guess in general, always start with listening. You never know what somebody's going through, and you may not have the full story because they might not be comfortable. And taking specific and explicit time out of your day, week, whatever it is, to meet and understand people at a little bit of a lower level. So that's one. As for folks who are ICs or currently ICs, I guess, realize that management is a two-way street. ICs certainly have a role to play here. I mean, obviously, being a manager is important, and there's a lot of things that we are trying to deal with to the best that we can, but also realize that you know your role is to communicate as well, and that is certainly a two-way street. We can't know what you don't tell us. We can observe and kind of verify, but the best way to really make progress is to just have that conversation. And again, easier said than done, fully admit to that. But that's certainly something that I sees not doing probably enough. Not that it's a bad thing, but I think you will get more when you are more even transparent with yourself and honest with yourself, and open up, because some great things can happen from that. And the last one I would say is for ICs wanting to be go into management, which is a very common occurrence. Managing and leading are two very different things. You can manage a project or a workload, or whether it's Jira or any of the other software tracking um, vendors out there. Being able to manage a team is different than being able to lead a team. Leading implies that there is a belief in your abilities, skill sets, and they are placing their trust in you to deliver something, whether that's business value, a feature. I mean, you could even extend that into like M&A, like, hey, I need you to get this deal done, right? And it is very difficult. It's a very difficult thing to learn, and it's not just a title, right? As much as I think certainly kind of going into it, I kind of had that mentality. It's like, okay, now I'm just managing backlogs and people have to do what I tell them to do, and that is not it at all. And it is way harder than you would think, and spend a ton of time on reviews and feedback. I mean, I guess it's more feedback for the managers. I spend at least an hour writing feedback, and I mean per person. And by doing that, I have found that I can achieve a lot of growth on behalf of the people in that report to me or report through me. It's a lot easier to, like, when you're going into promo meetings and stuff like that, it is, you have everything right there ready to go, and you can reference it from it. So spend a lot of time on your people, right? That's really what it amounts to. And listen.
That's great. Thank you, Wes, for being with us today.
Absolutely, thank you for having me. I appreciate the time. This is
This
great.
has been this has been great. And audience, let Wes and I know. Where do you want to spend your time? Thanks and have a great day.